Okay, so today's episode is something a little bit different, and it's one I've wanted to record since I started the podcast. And it's a theory that I've kind of been developing for a few years now, for no one but myself. And I call it the democracy of the mind. And I don't really know how to explain this other than to just get into it. So I feel like most topics can be looked at from two points of view, and both points of view, even if they're completely opposite, usually come from the heart. An example could be the COVID debate, right? Like, I feel like people generally fell into a category of one of two sides. And I really believe that people on both sides really were coming from a good place, from the heart. Another example is the abortion debate. I feel like people on one side really do believe that by being pro-life, that they're doing the right thing because they care about the life of the baby. And then I think on the other side, some women have abortions because in their soul, they know that they're doing the right thing and that that's a decision for them and them alone. And so for almost every topic, I believe that there's different perspectives, but people's different perspectives really do come from their heart. It's what their heart is telling them is the right thing to do. And I think the problem with our culture is that if someone has a different opinion to us, we presume that either they are evil or we believe that they are ignorant. And if they knew what we knew, then they would have the same opinion as us. And if we can just convince them, if we can just educate them, then they would be on our side and we would be right. And there's a really great image that I've seen online, and it's of a cylinder. So think about like a can of beans suspended from the roof. And if you were to shine a light on that can from one side, the shadow on the wall would be a rectangle. But if you moved around and shined that light from the front, the shadow would be a circle. And so both points of view are true. They're just different perspectives. I'll put this image in the podcast resources. And so the reason why I call this the democracy of the mind is because I try to see things from multiple perspectives before I make up my opinion, or to try and understand other people and where they're coming from. And I believe that 12 is a good number of perspectives that represent most of them. Don't ask me why I chose 12. I just pulled it out of my ass. Like, I'm not like really attached to this number of this theory. It's just, I think I like the number 12 because there's like, 12 numbers on the clock. There's 12 months in the year, zodiacs. Also, I was born on the 12th, so I was probably attached to it. But I feel like 12 is a good number of different perspectives. And I feel like of those 12, opinions fall loosely into two main categories, pro-abortion, pro-life. And I think this may be why in our culture we have the left and the right. I feel like people in general tend to fall into one or two sides, and that both sides are valid. And there's a great quote by F. Scott Fitzgeald who said, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." And I think that this is something that I try to practice, is to not make my mind up on issues until I've really contemplated from lots of different perspectives and heard different people's perspectives. But then ultimately I make my decision from the heart. And when I did my Bachelor of Science, I was literally trained to think critically, which is to kind of hold two opposing views and to not get so attached to the outcome. And also to understand that you have a bias, and there's nothing that you can do about that. Like, you can be aware of it and do your best to not let that influence your decisions. But because you are human, you will always have a bias, and that's something that you have to take into consideration. And I think that understanding that allows me to not judge others who have different opinions to me, and acknowledge that there will be times that I may be wrong or at least only partially correct, because both people can be right. And I think that's the bottom line. It's not like one side is right and one side is wrong. I think the truth is that we're both right. And I see this in relationships actually. When you're fighting with your partner and you're so adamant that you're right and you want them to admit that they're wrong, but then they might have a point of view and you're just like, oh, okay, I can kind of see how they thought that and that caused them to do that action. And both people think that they're right and the other person is wrong. And I think what happens is if you get into a relationship with someone who's better at arguing than you are, then things get off balance when only one person is admitting to be wrong when the other is not. And I've been on both sides of that. When really, I think what we need to do, not just in relationships, but in the world at large, is acknowledge that we're both right and both wrong in ways and have growth that we can do together. At the very least, I think that our culture needs to learn to agree to disagree and just respect other people's points of views and opinions. Think about the avid churchgoers who like protest against like gay rights. And it's like, I think that's an example of like, it's okay to have your point of view, but like, that's an example where I think like you need to keep that to yourself and respect other people's points of view. And I think that that's something that all of us need to do. I think the reason why we want to believe that the other person is either evil or ignorant is because we want to believe that other people are bad. We want to believe the worst in other people, because if we can believe that they're bad, then it means that we're good, and we create a hierarchy and place ourselves as superior. And it's really because we feel inferior a lot of the time. And I don't know, our world is just obsessed with this hierarchy, eh? And I think that we kind of look for things in other people that allow us to kind of feel better than them. Also, when I was diagnosed with autism, this came through extremely strong for me, because I feel like a lot of the categories that I naturally fall into are very different to the mainstream narrative of the category that you should fall in. And I think that the reason why for a lot of my life I felt very different or very wrong for who I am, I've said repeatedly how I've always felt like I've misrepresented myself, or people just, thought I was a bad person. I've had to prove that I was a good person. And I think a lot of it is that like I just naturally fall to this other side that, and I don't know if it's not a lot of other people don't fall to this side either, but I think that a lot of people, if they do, they feel afraid to speak up against the popular narrative, the mainstream narrative of what side you should fall on. And I think that's another problem with our culture, is that if you don't stand up for what you really believe and what is really true in your heart, then I think you're actually enabling and contributing to the problem by allowing it to gain more power and be the oppressive narrative. But it's interesting because with that being related to my autism, and I just know it is intuitively that it's connected to that, it made me think like how much of my autism is really an illness and how much is it that I just think differently? Do you know what I mean? And I feel as well in this world that I've been forced to know and understand others' perspectives, but they have not for me. So what the democracy of the mind means is to really analyze topics from lots of different points of view and perspectives. And until I've had like 12 perspectives, I don't feel like I have a well-rounded opinion. And I think on the surface, there's usually 2 points of view, and you don't have to go all the way into all 12. But I think if you really break it down and like go through it more intricately, that 12 is a good number for me, I feel, to really make my opinion up. And there's a lot of topics where, I haven't done that, and I've sat back and, I still haven't concluded exactly how I feel about an issue because I still feel ignorant on it. I still haven't, learnt enough, I feel, or considered it enough or contemplated it enough. And it's actually kind of difficult to sit in that discomfort of not knowing or not just choosing a side and being done. But I also enjoy that. I also acknowledge that these perspectives are always changing and evolving. And so it's not really like a methodical approach in a way. The other thing that democracy of the mind means to me is when I first started like meditating and looking inside, I realized that there were a lot of parts inside of me that were in conflict. For example, take the part of me that wants to be skinny and so starves myself, which is in conflict with the part of me that wants to eat to survive. And I started developing this theory before I knew about internal family systems, which teaches us that we all have many parts and is very common and normal for these parts to be in conflict. And what democracy of the mind meant to me at that time was I had to figure out a way to make all of these parts not be in conflict because it was causing too much fragmentation. And I had to figure out how to have more cohesion between these parts. And so the democracy of the mind meant to me being able to have different points of view inside myself and all parts of me being heard and more cohesion with those parts. I always say that I feel like our external world is a manifestation of our internal state. And I can't help but wonder if perhaps if we had more cohesion within ourselves, perhaps if we had less war within ourselves, that we would have less war with each other. if we could agree to disagree with the different parts inside of ourselves, then perhaps we could agree to disagree with the people in real life. You know, there's a quote from Game of Thrones that says, "We make peace with our enemies, not our friends." And so, yeah, this is what the theory of the democracy of the mind means to me. In short, it basically means people with different points of view to you are not necessarily evil or ignorant, but can actually have their opinion coming from their heart or in a good place, and that you can have opposing beliefs with another person and they can still be a good person. It's the idea of trying to understand 12 different points of views or perspectives on an issue to have a well-formed opinion. And it means to have democracy within the parts of your mind as a practice of being able to have that externally with the rest of the world.